Hi. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about SI and NI and what those functions actually are and do, and why we might find them occurring in the population at differing rates. Now, first, what are SI and NI? Well, they're set functions. Well, sets of what? Well, objects. NI, it's going to be sets of concepts, and SI is going to keep track of sets of physical objects. So what does that look like? Well, in the case of SI, right, that can take the form of a few different things. It can take the form of compound objects, or it can take the form of routines. Now, in the case of a compound object, we can give the example of a car, for instance. A car is a whole thing, right? But it's made up of a whole bunch of smaller constituent objects. So it has tires, it has an engine, it has a body, it has all of those things. And we can identify all of those things individually, but we can also see it as a functional whole and an object in and of itself called car, right? Now, this ability to see both the whole and the parts is what SI does. It organizes sets of objects into a compound object. And that compound object is a high-order SE object now. And for all intents and purposes, you can treat it as an object in and of itself, even though it's comprised of other constituent objects. Now, on the routine side, I like to give the example of you are aware of where all your dishes are in your house, and you're aware of what time you eat dinner, and you know how to get the food out of the oven and set the table and do all of those things. Well, what if you go to a friend's house that you've never been to? You walk in and you see them pulling food out of the oven, and it's around dinner time. Well, because you have experience with this pattern, and you can recognize that they're engaging in a partial execution of this pattern, you can extrapolate the rest of the pattern that you're familiar with, and you can likely go and find the plates, the bowls, the silverware, all of the things necessary to go set the table as your friend pulls the food out of the oven. They might not even need to prompt you to do this. And you're likely to be able to find all these things and know how to arrange them and how to use them, even though they're not your plates and they're not in your cabinets. But because you have an established idea of how these objects interact together, and then how to act in that world, that's the operator part, so that you can organize them appropriately. So in that instance, we can take patterns and we can apply them across a whole bunch of different objects, so long as those objects have similar boundaries and we can recognize that those boundaries interact in a way that we're familiar with. So what about NI? Well, NI, it's the same thing, right? So when we talk about like overarching themes, when we talk about things that are comprised of many different concepts, right? We take communism, Marxism, something like that, right? That's a particular concept, but it's not one concept. It's comprised of a ton of constituent concepts, right? We can see it as one thing, but we can also see it as all of the smaller things. We can see, a book as a book. We can also see it as chapters. We can also see it as paragraphs. We can see it as sentences. We can see it as words. We can see it as letters, right? And all of those exist simultaneously as a series of higher order and lesser order, or infraordinate and supraordinate objects. So, what about the relationship to time? Because this is a big one. NI always gets lumped in with time. And this is a funny one to me. Because NI and SI are both predicated on past experience. You recognize particular durable information shapes in your experience. And then you realize that they're recapitulated across a whole bunch of other object sets that will follow that same shape. So you don't need to necessarily know all of the individual objects. This is how NI comes to conclusions. Because I've seen this pattern once, and because I saw that the objects in that pattern all interacted in a certain way to produce a particular result, I can guess, given a certain amount of the pattern, what's missing, even if it's an object I'm not familiar with, right? Because I'm not analyzing the objects as much as I am the pattern, the information shape. So we are familiarized with these different patterns in our experience, And then later, in different situations, we see partial executions of these patterns, and then we can guess what's not there, whether that is in the physical world with SI or whether that's in the conceptual world with NI. Now, prediction, the future, right? Because both of these functions can be used to predict. Well, if you give me a particular concept, right, this is going to be for SI, because SI is going to move from a concept to a set of physical actions. If you give me a concept, I can guess what physical actions will accompany it, right? So in that other example with Marxism, if we talk about that as a single object and we don't care about its constituent components, but we're more concerned about how it shows up in the world, if you bring up communism with an SI user, they're probably going to tell you very particular and specific things about the type of actions that are associated with that concept across history. And this looks much more like an appeal to the past, because in some ways it is, but it isn't necessarily. Because if you ask them about communism in a new scenario, let's say you take a strong SI user and you ask them about communism, let's say in America, they're likely to give you the answer that those same action patterns will play out in America, even though America is comprised of a whole bunch of different objects that aren't associated with the other nations that have experienced communism in the past. So there's this durability of these shapes, and it doesn't necessarily matter if the exact same contents are placed in them. So long as you can recognize the shape, you can predict the way that the concepts or things will interact, the objects. So, okay, all of that said, why do we see SI and NI in the population at different rates? Well, there is a basement to how quickly SI can be transmitted across the culture. Because it's instantiated in actual actions, you have to act those actions out to propagate it across the culture. You actually have to show other people how to do it, and those people have to practice it and learn how to do it themselves. And so there's a maximum rate of exchange for SI across the culture. So if you give somebody a bad SI information shape, let's say you come up with a routine for executing a particular task, and you show that to someone else and they do it, and someone else does it, it can only get so far if it's a flawed concept, if it's a flawed action pattern. It can only get so far before people recognize it, and it can only hurt so many people. So you can have a lot of SI users coming up with a whole bunch of different action patterns across a society at a given time because they propagate very slowly. And so if somebody comes up with a flawed action pattern, it's unlikely that it's going to make it too far into the population before people recognize that it is flawed and that the damage from that flaw will be constrained to just a small portion of individuals who had the time to actually initiate that action pattern. Now, NI, on the other hand, because it takes almost no time at all to speak in comparison to actually show people how to do things, is much more dangerous. Because if you have a bad idea, you can transmit that bad idea very rapidly across people. Because people can speak very quickly. They can send a lot of information out with very little effort and propagate that across the population really quickly. Now that increases as you get more densely populated societies, right? So if I can talk to people in an amphitheater, now I'm talking to 100 people at a time. Well, what about when you get internet and television and radio and all of these things, and you can talk to entire nations or the world as a whole at once? Well, this is when NI gets really dangerous, because it can propagate bad ideas more rapidly than people can test them to find out that they're flawed. So people can institute these ideas and suffer the consequences on a scale that SI can really never achieve. So it makes sense in a population to have a limited number of NI users coming up with these new information shapes, because they're dangerous. They propagate too quickly, and if they're flawed, there's very little to constrain how many people they hurt and how far they go. So I think that's why we have a natural balance. There's a natural optimum for the number of NI users versus SI users, and I think as the rate of information exchange increases, that optimum is lower and lower and lower, and I think we're exceeding that optimum right now. You can see cultures all around the world are flooded with terrible ideas from every side because there are just too many people putting things together that don't go together and then telling everybody about it. So, anyway, with all of that said, I hope this was informative. It might have been a little rambly. It's kind of late, so I'm a little tired and not thinking as clearly as usual. But tell me what you think.